Thomas the Tank Engine is one of the most famous children's characters to come out of the 20th century, telling rather wholesome stories of a really useful engine who's nice to a fault and always tries to do the right thing along with his friends in a cozy English countryside setting. There are very few fictional trains that are as beloved as this one. His one and only theatrical outing, however, is another story. Being what can only be described as a mess, Thomas and the Magic Railroad is one film that many fans of the Little Blue Train would rather forget exists. But where exactly did it all go wrong? And does it at least hold up as a children's movie or not? And today, I'd like to try and answer those questions to the best of my ability. And there will be spoilers for Thomas and the Magic Railroad ahead, so in case for any reason you don't want to know how it ends, don't proceed any further. You have been warned. Okay, so the biggest reason for the failure of Thomas and the Magic Railroad by far is due to its terrible production. Now, I already covered this in another video I made on Diesel 10, which you can find a link in the description to, but to go over it again, originally the movie was going to focus a lot more on the character of Brunette Stone and his rivalry with who was supposed to be the real villain of the film, P.T. Boomer. Because in their youth, Boomer wanted Tasha, Brunette's eventual wife, for himself, and became insanely jealous of him when he won her affections instead. So despite Brunette in his old age, Boomer is searching for Lady in order to destroy her, as it was he, not Diesel 10, who had caused her to crash all those years earlier. And these scenes were supposed to be intercut with what was going on the island of Sodor, which is closer to what's shown in the final film with more clarification, as well as Diesel 10 simply being a new recruit who decides to go rogue and start causing problems. However, test audiences found P.T. Boomer to be too scary of a villain for small children and demanded he be cut from the film, so as a result, the movie was heavily re-edited and certain sequences reshot in order to remove any mention of him save for a brief moment where he can be seen on a motorcycle. But as a result, his absence is most definitely felt, as it feels as if something important is missing without him, and this is perhaps most evident in Peter Fonda's performance, as he played Brunette Stone the way he did due to the character's backstory that was heavily explored in the original cut. But when P.T. Boomer was nixed, most of that backstory went with him, leaving many to feel that Fonda's performance was out of place in a children's movie without that context. And then there's also his line in the final chase,
"No, you won't, because the magic you refuse to believe in will get the better of you."
Which makes absolutely no sense delivered at Diesel 10, as he clearly believes in the magic that's shown to exist. But this line was actually from the original version, where P.T. Boomer is riding on top of Diesel 10 during the final chase, and not only was the line directed at him, but the original line was actually,
"No, you won't, Boomer, because the magic you refuse to believe in will get the better of you."
Which makes a lot more sense, as in the original cut, Boomer was shown to have an extreme disdain for magic and the joys that it brings people. Now, as I just noted, obviously butchering the film in post-production didn't do it any favors, as once again, a lot of stuff doesn't make too much sense with a key component of the story missing from it, as the example I just gave perfectly demonstrates. Frankly, children as small as 7 years old could probably tell that there was something off about it, because in the movie as is, a lot of stuff isn't properly explained. Though to be completely fair, one of the only things that's arguably better in the theatrical version over the original cut is the character of Diesel 10, as not only is his voice better, but due to being promoted to the main villain, he gets a lot more time to shine and makes for a surprisingly effective, entertaining, and dark villain for a series like Thomas the Tank Engine, as I discussed in the aforementioned video. It's honestly no wonder that out of all the characters introduced in this movie, Diesel 10 would be the only one to make a reappearance later on, as he's arguably the best thing about the theatrical cut. But somewhat surprisingly, cutting P.T. Boomer and heavily re-editing the film isn't even the only problem it suffered from, because the charm of Thomas the Tank Engine mainly came from the fact that it was a very low-key series set in a cozy English countryside where even the highest stakes weren't that big, and the only fantasy element to it was the talking trains. But rather than embrace that, the movie instead decided to not only combine Thomas with two other British shows that were popular at the time, but also introduce magic to the mix. And as I noted in my video on making movie adaptations of TV shows, which you can also find a link in the description to, that wasn't exactly the best way to appeal to the series' target audience. Because simply put, magic doesn't belong in Thomas the Tank Engine, so its inclusion removed a lot of the charm that made many fall in love with it in the first place. And there's also the fact that by trying to combine three shows into one film, it ends up having to juggle several different subplots all at once. Honestly, cutting P.T. Boomer may not have been such a bad thing if they had then used that time to flesh out some of the other story beats, but they didn't do that. And as a result, the movie ends up not being so much about Thomas, but a bunch of human characters that the audience isn't nearly as attached to. And as I said in my video on introducing new characters, which you can also find a link in the description to, an influx of new characters at the expense of the old is often a telltale sign that a story isn't going to be very good, and this is no exception. Because for being called Thomas and the Magic Railroad, Thomas himself only gets 11 minutes of screen time in an hour-and-a-half film, while most of the movie is actually centered around Mr. Conductor. In fact, it's often believed that even apart from P.T. Boomer, another reason test audiences didn't like the original version was because it didn't spend enough time on Sodor, but it seems that even with a greater focus on the trains, it just wasn't enough. Because to put it simply, even setting aside just how great of a villain he is, a major reason Diesel 10 is the only universally liked new character in the movie is because he actually fits the setting of Thomas the Tank Engine. If one were to imagine what the villain of a Thomas movie would actually look like, a diesel train with a bad attitude, hatred of steam engines, and a hydraulic claw that he's not afraid to use would actually be a pretty likely candidate. But stuffing in a broken old man with a magic train, his granddaughter, and a couple of conductors in desperate need of magic dust conversely do not fit into such a setting, and thus the audience is more likely to resent their inclusion rather than appreciate it, unlike Diesel 10. Now, some have also pointed out that Alec Baldwin's performance as Mr. Conductor probably didn't do the character any favors, but to be completely fair, at least he's trying. He could have easily just phoned the whole thing in for a paycheck, so you've got to give the guy credit for at least trying to engage with the children and give them a fun time, even if the results aren't great, and the role should have probably gone to somebody better suited for it. But speaking of that, all of this isn't to say that the movie didn't have potential. Everybody involved is clearly taking it seriously and wants it to be the best film it possibly can. Many have even singled out the soundtrack in particular as being practically Oscar-worthy, and there are a few sequences that in isolation are pretty brilliant, most notably the revival of Lady and the Magic Railroad, as well as the chase sequence with Diesel 10 immediately after, which is actually pretty intense for a kids movie, as well as a few other scenes. In the end, this movie could have been really good. There was clearly a lot of love and dedication put into it, and it shows in the sequences that weren't as heavily affected by the recut or focused more on the trains. But when it was butchered in post-production, most of that passion went right out the window, and only glimpses of the Thomas movie that could have been, had the writers had their priorities straight from the beginning, remain. So when all is said and done, Thomas and the Magic Railroad isn't a very good movie due to a combination of many different factors. Because even if tearing apart the original version is mostly to blame for the film's flaws, that still doesn't change the fact that there still wasn't enough focus on Thomas himself from the very beginning. But once again, it does have its good moments, so it's not awful. It isn't great either, as the plot is rather confusing and hard to follow, as I noted before, but it's not downright unwatchable either, especially for children. And in the end, considering the movie was made for kids, I'd have to say it's slightly below average. Because while it would do its job of entertaining its target audience, it doesn't really have anything to offer beyond that, aside from a few laughs and maybe an emotional moment or two. And kids really do deserve better than that. Honestly, the biggest problem this movie had right from the start is that it was trying to do too much at once. It tried to combine 3 shows together, shoved a bunch of plot points into a kids' movie, introduced high fantasy concepts that children might have a hard time understanding, and when test audiences didn't like it, they removed a major character, thus making everything even more confusing, and just expected audiences to go along with the final product. And considering Thomas the Tank Engine was known for being very simple in nature, how they expected the results to be anything other than a disaster is mind-boggling. Because when you really look at everything I just went over, Thomas and the Magic Railroad is just about as far removed from Thomas the Tank Engine as you can get in almost every regard. It never feels like the Thomas the Tank Engine show at all, but rather a movie that just happens to have the character in it. Again, it's not outright horrible, it does get good in a few places, but on the whole, this was most definitely not the movie most fans of Thomas were looking for. And considering the mess that is the finished film, it's impossible to blame them for feeling that way. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that Thomas and the Magic Railroad was a mess and completely undeserving of being the only theatrically released film starring everybody's little favorite blue train? Or do you believe it's underrated and that I'm not giving it its due credit? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as I always say, everybody is entitled to their own opinion on this channel, so if you think I was completely wrong about Thomas and the Magic Railroad, that is most definitely your right to feel that way, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.